My name is John Pace. I grew up in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, at the age of 17, I found myself involved in the criminal justice system that caused me to be sentenced to die in prison. The story that I'm currently talking about is about systemic inequality that exists in marginalized communities and how systemic inequality contributes to outcomes in these communities, and ultimately how it contributes to those who find themselves in the criminal justice system, involved in the system. And I actually believe it contributes to mass incarceration. I often remember growing up with 11 brothers and sisters and a single mother. I remember oftentimes just loved playing sports, being able to go to movies. One of the things that I saw as I started to grow up, I started to see myself like wandering. And part of that wandering was because by being raised by a single mother, oftentimes as I would come home, my mother would not be home because she was working. But I would have the opportunity to be able to go out and hang out with my friends. And it started off innocently. We would just go out and hang out and just play sports. But as I started getting older, I started to see myself becoming more curious about the things existing around me. And many of those things existed around me in the neighborhood were negative things. But these were people that I were actually looking up to though. And so I started to make bad decisions as a result of that. And ultimately it landed me in prison. It landed me in prison serving a life sentence at the age of 17 years old. Inherently, I didn't think that I was a bad person. And so I started asking myself, why me? Why did I ultimately find myself as one of the persons that's here in prison? And I remember just talking to an older guy and me and him really diving into like this subject. And actually he introduced me to Malcolm X. As I started reading the book, I'm like, he went through the same experiences that I went through. So I said, this is something that's like really deeply ingrained in communities. This is a deep systemic history that has been impacting communities of color. We need to look at that there's a connection with regard to the resources and policies that actually perpetuate these bad practices, that actually contributes to people making bad decisions that ultimately land them into prison. When I go in some of these communities and I see the way the community look, and I say to myself, how does this breed hope? How does this, create in the spirit of people that's growing up in these communities, that spirit that they want to be able to excel or be hopeful about what the future looks like. When I think about the legacy of slavery, I think that there's a connection with the disregard for those people who are growing up in these particular communities because we don't value them the same way we might value other people. I see it very prevalent in Philadelphia in that way. The Intergenerational Healing Circle is really about exploring trauma, is exploring experiences that we all go through together. The men that I decided to put in the Intergenerational Healing Circle and interview, all of them were individuals who were unfortunately impacted by the criminal justice system at a young age. One thing we've always done is we've always supported each other. My hope is that by showing that it is generational, that we can say, okay, what aren't we doing? Whether it's policymakers, whether it's community members, in terms of better things that we can do, what aren't we doing that we can do better? Let's begin to have a conversation that we can begin to stamp out these systemic issues that have been going on for a while now.
Welcome everybody. Peace. Yeah, of course, good to see you brothers, man. It's always a blessing to be with y'all. Thank you for coming. It's a Saturday, it's a hot Saturday too. Imagine we could be doing a lot of different things, but we're here. As part of our conversation today, or the process of our conversation, we're gonna incorporate something called a talking piece. So I wanna use this today for thoughtfulness and just, making sure that we see each other the way we need to be seen, more or less, symbolically, right? The conversation that we're going to have today, we're going to touch on trauma, but more importantly, we're going to talk about post-traumatic growth, like what are the strengths that we had to draw on in order to overcome trauma and not let it define us and guide us for the rest of our life. And so we really appreciate you taking your time, to come and kick it with each other. But that's what we do.
Absolutely.
That's what we do. And this is really what the Intergenerational Healing Circle is about. Do you know who counseled each of us to deal with the traumas of long-term imprisonment and all the other challenges that come with that? Each other. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Right. We held each other up, and we weren't trained therapists, we weren't trained psychologists and counselors, right. But we counseled each other in the workout pit, in the law library, in the yard, walking the yard, in each other's cells, you know what I'm saying? We were the ones.
You know, if somebody was having a bad time, let's say, for example, we lost a loved one, we would circulate the word among ourselves, and we would let people keep an eye on him, man. You know, he just lost his father. And then the word would go out to the yard, and everybody would be aware of that, and they would treat you in a way that, you know, was sensitive to the loss that you just suffered.
That's right.
You know, right. And in that way, we made each other aware of the difficulties that some of us might be facing.
Skeet just lost his mother.
Yeah.
You know, and I said, Skeet, I know you crying. You know, you're not showing that. I don't see there's no tears there, but I know you're crying inside because I know you. You come from that system I come from. We don't just, some of us, you know, it's emotional and let it go. But right. The school that we come from, we cry a lot inside. So I say, you know, do you need me? You know, can I come over? So I was there for him.
One quality, one strength that you had to draw on in order to rise above trauma. You understand what I'm saying? And, right, think about one and write it on the index paper.
I don't got the answers figured out yet, but I do got his patience. You know what I'm saying? And that's kind of like what makes me as a person. Like, mainly, is just having patience, figuring it out, and not really going against time. I ain't gonna lie, like going against time is like used to be one of my biggest downfalls. It stays with you. You know what I'm saying? Like, it stays with you. You go to, like, it's not only do you go to jail, you be in jail for all this fucking time. Then you leave jail and they still, like, make it difficult for you to even be a person. And I hate that. Work at a warehouse or do labor. Be a slave. You already a felon. Go ahead. And I did that for damn near 3 years. For me in South Philly, it was the beginning of my young years when I really became violent because of this lack of money and resources. There was no job. You know, I was young, I didn't have any father. That was the start of me being like going down a real bad road for myself. My mind in South Philly was wrapped in just gang activities. It was wrapped in that. It wasn't any other option but to just do that. We do formulate some type of brotherhood amongst ourselves, either if it's good or bad. A lot of us don't get a lot of love from our households. And so we're doing whatever in the house, we're doing whatever outside and in the school. Most of us ain't have our fathers. So there wasn't really any guidance. So we had to really guide each other. So that's how we really like became like a group. All right, now this is our group. We locked in, no new friends. Nobody that's outside of this area is a part of this group. A lot of us made the same choices because we all came from the same place. It was either you be a part of this or you outsider, you outcaster. And a lot of us didn't really want to be an outcaster or an outsider, or we couldn't be an outcast or an outsider because we all live in the same neighborhood. We don't really know anything else or try to learn anything different. And it's like, well, this is making us the most money. This is keeping our roof over our head, keep our electric and gas on. Why stop? I was young when I went to jail. I got charged as an adult because it's an adult crime. So what's an adult crime? And then they stamp you with this like image that you're forever a bad person. Right? You're forever this. You're a convicted felon, and now it's very hard for you to live again. I wish the jail didn't exist. I think they should throw the whole thing in the trash.
And why do you say that?
It's jail. I mean, I know it's supposed to put bad people away, but even doing so, it's almost like torture. It don't take 25 years for somebody to know that they did something wrong.
So it's all of these things that's converging that's driving us out of our minds, man. You know what I'm saying? It's driving us crazy. It's not, it's hard for us, our young people, to hold on to their sanity and their sense of humanity, for the parents to hold on to their sanity and their sense of humanity with all of these converging traumas and and stressors and stuff like that. Not to make an excuse, man, but I don't think that our children need fixing, or I think what needs fixing is the world that they're being brought into. In the islands, while I was still in Trinidad, everybody in authority resembled my family, from police officers to my teachers to doctors, all the way up to the Prime Minister at the time was Eric Williams. When I first came to America, predominantly the people in authority didn't look like my family. You know what I'm saying? Now, not only did they not look like my family, I started to get a sense of racial differences and class differences. I had a sense that I was different. I was getting in fights over my accent, so I had to lose my accent really quick. I remember my mom working sometimes 16 hours, coming home 1 o'clock in the morning. And the sacrifice was me being home alone. You know what I'm saying? At a very young age. Being raised by TV and radio and things like that. I wanted to be independent. I wanted to make my own way. I wanted to prove myself. Being respected and having dignity amongst my peers, right, took precedence over everything. I didn't even care about an education anymore. I think those were the things that yanked me out of my mother's home into the dangerous streets and on this dangerous adventure, 250 plus miles away from my home in Brooklyn, New York, to Philadelphia, in the company of a gang. The new challenges that the crack era presented to young people, the temptations, the false promises, this is your way out of poverty, this is the way out of lack and deprivation. The education that I was receiving in school didn't prepare me for that. I worked in drug houses, selling cocaine out of fortified row homes for these gangs. Why be on this time-consuming, tedious, fruitless, futile pursuit of education to get the American dream when I could get the American dream this way? And I was sucked right in. And that's a challenge, not being equipped by the education system, not being equipped to deal with these new threats, you know what I'm saying? And having my young, immature mind, having to contend with that, it's a losing battle. It didn't take long for me to get that type of consciousness after I got in prison, even at the age of 15 and 16, reading political books. It clicked for me. The prison industrial complex and the people that run it thrive off of the violence and victimization. That's what keeps it going. Climate change, environmental justice, environmental racism is probably one of the clearest indicators of how this city is segregated. 68% of Black people live within 3 miles of coal refineries. We live near toxic waters. We're more exposed to lead poisoning. Policies that confine entire neighborhoods to what's called heat islands, because there are a lack of trees where we live. We're in these concrete spaces, confined to these spaces with all of these converging policies that disenfranchise and disinvest in us. Our depression rate is high, anxiety rate is high, developmental issues in our young people that impede our ability to make good decisions. It's just not a good picture, man. It's just not a good picture. I don't think the violence that we see in our young people is the problem. I think the violence that we see in our young people is the result of the problem. We were the ones that made sure that each of us was able to step out of prison after 30, 40, 50 years of imprisonment with everything still intact, our dignity still intact. We did that for each other without training. And that doesn't mean that when we come out here, we still don't need some work done. But it's all about us now continuing to hold each other up, be a source of guidance for each other, and moral support, and so on and so forth. That's what the intergenerational healing circle is about, because healing is important and necessary, especially after long-term imprisonment, right?
You know, I always kind of like stood my ground, you know, because I believed in me, you know, even though I had doubt. I had doubt for a long time, but I still stayed steadfast because I just refused to give in to what I felt people saw in me. There's so much, you know, that I feel that I don't try to hide it no more. And I don't feel that I have a need to hide it. You know, learning to be vulnerable.
There's power in it.
It is, man. It really is. And it's a wonderful thing. And the feelings that I get, the feeling that I get from, you know, when I let it go, it's beautiful, man. And I had what you might call a normal childhood. My parents struggled. And I remember times when they couldn't pay certain bills. It was a little tough, you know, but it wasn't unusual. That's the thing. It wasn't unusual because there were a lot of families just like mine. But school was very important to me. And it was like the best of times for me when I went to school. When we graduated to the 7th grade, they actually bused my whole school to a school in South Philadelphia. They bused the whole school, everybody but me. And I didn't understand why. And the school I wound up going to was Gillespie. And I was going by myself. This was the devastation that occurred to me. The fact that I was being ripped away from what was most important to me at that time in my life, what meant so much to me. This next chapter was about to unfold, and I didn't know anything about it, and I'm going into something totally new, and without my friends, without people that I grew up with and was close to. That chapter that was opened in my life turned out to be very negative. I didn't want to go. And so I'd find ways not to go and ditch and, you know, just run the streets. I didn't have nowhere to go. I didn't have no friends to hang out with. What happened was I wound up going to an off-campus school called Abraham Lincoln High. And this was my first experience, you know, face-to-face with racism, because it was an all-white school. I got attacked. Somebody hit me from behind because he was yelling in my ear. And I didn't really, you know, turn around or give it any play because I didn't want to mess up what I had. You know, I understood that it was a privilege to be able to go to school every day. The cops that came to get me, they weren't trying to protect me. You know, they weren't trying to look out for me. You know, and they were yelling things and throwing things and, you know, grabbing at me, and it was all kinds of madness. You know, we were all dealing with people who hated us, didn't think of us as human beings. That course that I found myself on was tampered with. It had the effect that I believe they wanted it to have. It destroyed our families. Directly related to policies. It's directly related to concept and an idea that we're valueless. There were policies that were being designed specifically to separate families. They destroyed an entire black community of people who were fending for themselves. In what they say, the land of the free and all of that nonsense and capitalism and you can come here and anybody can make it. When we were making it, when we were doing it ourselves, the evil that was perpetrated on black people, that's a devastating thing, man. You wipe out a whole community of people that ain't asking you for nothing.
This is what I couldn't wait to tell you all about.
Everything we eat, drink, sleep, do from dusk till dawn, dawn till dusk, is decided by policy. And one of the things I hear often when we talk about young people, particularly young people in cities, particularly Black young people in cities, is how we get them to make better choices. So when we're talking about the decision to engage in underground economies, to find ways to make money, it's because people don't have money. It's because their parents don't have access to jobs and living wages. Teenagers shouldn't have to make those kinds of decisions, but they do in the context of the conditions we created of poverty. And Black people have been in these conditions for generations, intentionally so.
Certain neighborhoods in Philadelphia, in cities across the United States, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, have all experienced histories of redlining. It's an intentional practice that is predatory, and it targets predominantly communities of color by no fault of their own, where renting and selling of homes and apartments will only be granted to certain people, and a lot of times that has been exclusionary of communities of color. It creates these pockets and neighborhoods where poverty is much higher, where it is harder for people to live. There's less access to healthcare centers, quality grocery stores, and green space. These were funded in other neighborhoods, but not in these neighborhoods that were historically divested from and falsely stereotyped and labeled as unsafe neighborhoods. And all of those were intentional choices and intentional policy choices.
Some of the violence we see, we can understand as interpersonal. And that has everything to do with the kind of sustained deprivation, the kind of sustained desperation, trauma that people are required to live in the mundanity of poverty, going every day not knowing where you're going to live, if you're going to have stable housing, if you're going to eat, where that food is going to come from. And we can deter a lot of what we see as that frame that comes from desperation and living in these poverty conditions. We can address all of that.
The narratives around these kids focuses solely on the harm that they may have caused and never the harm that they've experienced themselves. They have experienced more loss than anybody should ever experience. They have witnessed more violence than anyone should have to experience. They don't understand who these young people are, and it doesn't recognize the humanity, and that they are also whole people, and that we're judging somebody on the mistakes that have happened on the worst day of their life.
How do we create an environment where all kids have the same amount of decisions, the same kinds of decision making, the same access to develop their gifts and talents, the same time and space to do that, the same after school programs? We can't set some kids up to win and others to fail and then tell them to make better choices. We have to invest in the people of Philadelphia. And if we continue to put our biggest investments into policing, we're going to get the same outcomes we've been getting. Our poverty rate between the city and suburbs, with all of it combined, is just above one of the areas of Silicon Valley in California. So there's a lot of wealth in Philadelphia. It's just not distributed to most of the people who live inside the city limits. Enslaved people were critical for building wealth in this country. We're in a service economy where fewer and fewer people are needed to do these jobs. That is the Black and brown folks, right? The problem is still white supremacy. The problem is still racism. The problem is still class exploitation. Instead of actually addressing the root causes of poverty, the root causes of the violence that we observe, which is not a reason to expand our prison system, but in fact a reason to invest in our people, then we're going to see the same outcomes, because the prison system is profitable. And until that profit motive no longer exists, we will continue to expand it.
Poverty is big business, and we want to be honest. People benefit off of poverty. This is generational disinvestment in Black and brown and marginalized communities that lead us to the conditions that we have currently. Whether it's gun violence, whether it's poverty, whether it's mass incarceration, it all starts from the disinvestments in certain zip codes and area codes around education, housing, and access to opportunities. And until we break those cycles, we're going to find ourselves having this same conversation 10, 20 years from now. As a Black mom, a Black woman, I never had the opportunity to tap out of what's happening in my city. Because every time we take a nap, they take advantage. That's why I ran for office. That's why I'm here. One of my colleagues always said, Councilmember Brooks said she didn't come here to make friends. And I meant that. I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to make a difference. And part of making a difference is standing on principle and policy. If you really want change, you got to hold people to the fire. You need to make sure it gets into the ears of the folks that are making the decision. This office is the people's office. Our number one responsibility is to set the city's budget. In my role, I only can speak for me. Constituent services is like top of the line. So when you call my office about an alley being dirty or something, Charlene's gonna call and see if we can get that fixed for you. Because the only way we can get people involved is for them to feel heard. And too often in our communities, our marginalized communities, Black, brown, poor, our voices aren't heard, or we feel like it's not heard, or we're ignored. And it's bigger than just voting. It's about keeping folks accountable to the people. If it's not impacting the community as a whole, I'm not doing my job. That's why I'm a legislator. I do solid policy work around things that are important to me. Housing, make sure that we're not perpetuating gentrification in a way to push out our seniors, our community members, access to quality education, fully resourced schools, safe schools in every neighborhood, period. Quality jobs above $725 for folks that live here in Philadelphia. The only way out of poverty is making sure people have opportunities for access to get outside of this secular cycle of low-wage jobs. People don't choose that. That's just what's afforded to them. Mass incarceration and incarceration in general are all a part of failed policy or just policy in general. I tap into my brothers who have been formerly incarcerated in those organizations that serve them. I'm not the expert. That's not my lived experience. So I believe in tapping into those who are the experts that make sure that I'm not perpetuating the system of mass incarceration and doing harm to my community. That's how you do good policy, because a lot of times people that are writing this stuff aren't impacted. I came into office as a leader and a legislator to break cycles. Every piece of legislation, every piece of policy is grounded in changing the material lives of working class Black and brown folks in our city.
Steve, you used a word that I thought was missing up to this point. That word was hope. I think Father Greg Boyle said it best: no child with hope ever joins a gang. And I would add, no child with hope ever just picks up a gun and just shoot anybody for no reason. No child with hope ever just decides to do drugs. We're definitely dealing with a crisis of hopelessness.
I think community members oftentimes aren't aware that a lot of these things that they see in the community are the results of bad policies, and that they do have a voice, and that their voice does count when it comes to who's in office. There aren't a lot of investments that are actually taking place in marginalized communities for people who live in these communities to excel. As policymakers, they need to begin to look at how are we providing resources for people in these communities to actually excel and be their best selves. And so you can hold them accountable in the sense of saying to them, these things need better improvement. Education system need to be improved. We want to see more investment in these areas. So you can hold them accountable in that way, but you need to be aware of what your power actually is. When I think about the legacy of slavery, there's a disregard for Black lives. It actually contributes to trauma that exists in a lot of the communities that we grew up in. And that's what the intergenerational healing circle is, I think, similar. We were all teenagers who were sentenced to die in prison. A lot of our resilience has been that we've been able to help support each other and take care of each other. If we're aware there's a lack of resources, I think we realize that, okay, we need to do other things then. We need to have conversations about it so that we can be better equipped to be able to confront what the impact of policies are. We can build power from that experience and be able to contribute to the future.